to the Inter-American Dialogue. It's such a pleasure to be here and to host this conversation on a topic that is increasingly relevant in the region and here in the United States. The US is having elections next week, and Latin America is in a constant electoral cycle. So in this context, the key question that we want to address today is, what are the implications of social media on elections? Social media platforms play a critical role on electoral context. They are a source of information. They are a tool to expand the reach of electoral campaigns. And they are also a way to avoid official censorship in closed or semi-closed societies. But the failure to properly regulate social media or self-regulation of these platforms while respecting free speech can contribute to disinformation, to misinformation, and this is a growing concern due to the existing polarization in our region. We have a fantastic panel today that will share what we can learn from the latest elections in Argentina, in Brazil, in Mexico, in Venezuela. And we want to answer questions like, what are the key challenges and opportunities that social media access present in electoral contexts? What are the role that social media platforms are playing in the United States in the upcoming elections? And what are the differences and similarities that with recent elections in Latin America? Which social media platforms and regulations are compatible with free speech? And what role can civil society, and we have a great representation of civil society in this panel, can play to safeguard the right to access to information and to protect freedom of expression? Before turning the moderator to our fantastic moderator today, I want to thank Luminate for their partnership in organizing this event. One of the main objectives here at the Dialogue is to build bridges between Washington and the region and to bring new voices to these conversations here in Washington. And this is a great example of that. And we look forward to greater collaboration and working on these issues together in the future. And I'll just finalize by introducing today's moderator, Roberta Braga. Roberta is the founder and executive director of the Digital Democracy Institute of the Americas. This is a nonpartisan nonprofit dedicated to strengthening a healthier internet for Latinos in the US and Latin America. She's worked for years in US, Latin America foreign policy, democracy building, and campaigns and communications, and on projects countering disinformation and misinformation in elections. So she has a lot to bring to this conversation. Thank you, Roberta, for being here with us. Just a housekeeping note for those of you who need simultaneous translation. This event is going to be available in English, Spanish, and Portuguese. Interpretation is available via Zoom. Roberta, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And thank you to the entire Inter-American Dialogue team. It's really great to be back here. My name is Roberta, as Tamara just mentioned, and I am really excited to be having this conversation, not only because we're 1 week out from one of the most consequential elections in the United States, but also because this has, as you mentioned, been a huge year for elections. And I think that it's really uncovered for us some of those tough challenges that a lot of us have been tackling for a long time. Those came to a fore this year, but also because I feel like society has evolved a lot since we first started engaging heavily in this disinformation set of issues, which for me was in 2016. We've come a long way since then. And so I'm really happy to be here with my fellow experts in this space. I'll start by introducing each of you very, very quickly because I want to hold most of the conversation for discussion. So I'll start with Pedro. On my left, Pedro Vaca is the Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression at the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. He's a Colombian lawyer with years of experience in this and has litigated on behalf of victims of serious violations of freedom of expression. So he'll be really bringing this perspective to the fore. Cecilia Galvan, who's joining us digitally, or virtually rather, is a senior researcher and director of research and advocacy at Civic Compass, and she leads studies on the impact of digital politics and internet regulation on strengthening civil society and its capacity to influence political processes. Iria Puyosa on my right is Senior Research Fellow at the Democracy and Tech Initiative at the Atlantic Council, where I used to work myself. She's been doing really wonderful work, not only on point-to-point encrypted platforms like WhatsApp, but also on Venezuela, her country of origin. And I know that we've worked together on a few things. But she's researched everything from information warfare to coordinated propaganda, politically motivated trolling and disinformation. And then last but not least, we have Martha Tudon, who's also joining us virtually. Martha's Digital Rights Program Officer at Article 19, based in Mexico. She's in the Office for Mexico and Central America. So really, we do have the entire region represented, it feels like today. But she serves as the Digital Rights Program Officer there, and she's leading investigations and political and media advocacy processes. And so I'm really just going to dive right into the conversation at this point. We do have Q&A at the end, so feel free to weigh in. And we're excited to have this be very interactive, I think somewhat informal. So no presentations or anything like that. And I'm gonna dive in just like with a big question to start us off. Because when we talk about social media and elections, I feel like we're talking about a whole slew of different things. Everything from the effects of hyperconnectivity on human behavior, the economics of campaigning online, community building, digital political advertising and campaigns, polarization, distrust, but also connection. And so I just wanted to start with a question that will go to all of our panelists today. And that one is, if you were to think of the intersection of social media and elections, what is one thing that keeps you up at night? And what is one thing that you're excited for the future? And I'll start with Pedro.
Thank you, Roberta. The thing that keeps me up during the night is this paradox of knowing that part of the bad behaviors in the political sphere comes directly from political leaders and political parties. So I think that we consider democracy as a frame in which the actors that participate in are going to behave in a way that, for example, is not does not increasing into stigmatization of journalists, spreading fake news, stimulating hate or discrimination. And to see that, it's something that I think is very disruptive. What I think could be like exciting for the future is that probably this is a moment in which, because of social media, there's a massive involvement in politics. Politics 20 years ago could be something isolated through elites, and I think that massive people is engaged with decisions that are going into elections.
Well, I really like that perspective, very positive. Iria?
And I think this thing bother me more, concern me more, is the use of social media as a accessory for surveillance and repression. I see that becoming increasingly more common. It's not just about monitoring, like used to be, monitoring trends. Is becoming more direct attacks and using social media to geolocate people and to go after people physically. And that is probably one of the most worrisome trends I've been seeing in the last couple of years. And the positive side, I believe the most interesting thing I'm seeing now is communities, grassroots activists are reclaiming social media. After a few years of retreat, they are coming back and finding innovative ways to use that for their cause and their activities. So that is a nice development to see right now.
Cecilia and Martha, I'll go to you in a second, but I'll also add one second question to that. So not only what keeps you up at night and what you're excited about, but given that this year we've seen presidential elections in Mexico, we've seen presidential elections last year in Argentina, Venezuela, I wondered if you could also share from your perspectives, being where you are, what stood out to you about the use of social media in your country's elections? How did you kind of engage with countering online harms from your vantage point, from the civil society side of things? And we'll start with Martha.
Of course. Well, I think what keeps me up at night is the fact that there's kind of a mismatch between what we understand as protected speech and unprotected speech. And why is that? Why is it we're afraid of, and what do we want to tackle? Because it seems sometimes, and I'm also referring to what Pedro mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, in these kind of dialogues and debates, there's a lot of blaming in the digital platforms that, believe me, they're very responsible of a lot that's going on online. But the thing is that who is really responsible when we are talking about electoral processes? We're talking about those who are contending for power. We're talking about political parties, and they are the ones who have to be regulated in a way that it's consistent with the democratic values and principles, because otherwise all the solutions that have been proposed kind of want to regulate digital platforms, and the solutions often come with a cost that is so much bigger than the problem it's trying to solve. The thing that excites me the most is I think the people, society has become more aware on the actions that they have to kind of address directly with those who are contending in the power. It doesn't matter if they spreading disinformation in the street or in their Facebook accounts. They are now acknowledging that it's not internet that is the problem, but they have to go with the people that are lying to them and are trying to get into power. So I think that's kind of a shift in the mindset of everyone, because internet is not this big demon that is gonna come and horrorize us all. And what we have been doing, particularly from Article 19, it's the work with journalists. Of course, journalism is a main part of the democratic system, and a lot of things have to be addressed in a way that it's very fruitful for society. Just not just saying you can't say this, you have to remove this, you have to censor this, but it's better to ask questions. And the people who are trained to ask these questions in the better way, in a way that is going to be framed into a whole context, are journalists. So I think that's a big part of our job.
Yes, absolutely. We've worked with a lot of Latino journalists covering the US elections this year, and we really see how they're at the front lines of this in a lot of ways. Cecilia, I'll go to you next.
Thank you very much. I will make my speech in Spanish, if it's okay. Bueno, hay algo que, bueno, saludos a todos, por supuesto, y hay algo que me quita el sueño claramente con respecto a esto de las redes sociales y las elecciones, los procesos de elecciones, que es la respuesta a los diagnósticos sobre la calidad de la conversación, ¿no? Básicamente, la respuesta tiene que ver con una mirada desde tomadores de decisión que se ven agraviados, ¿no?, por ciudadanos o por otros contendientes en los procesos electorales, y enseguida la primera respuesta es hay que frenar esto, ¿no? Hay que controlar estos discursos que los llaman discursos de odio o, digamos, o violencia digital, e instalan esta cuestión, pero no se dan cuenta, digamos, de la forma en la cual esto se origina, cómo se valida. Entonces, lo que primero me preocupa es esta tendencia de los gobiernos a querer, digamos, regular las redes sociales, ¿no?, sumado a este fantasma que apareció en el 2023, fines de 2023, 2024, que es la inteligencia artificial como un detonante de fake news, de deep fakes, que llaman la atención, pero no tenemos evidencia todavía que genere daño. Digamos, no está la evidencia ni hacia dónde, digamos, cuáles son los valores, como decía Marta, ¿no?, y como decían anteriormente, que se están dañando hoy en las redes sociales a través de la inteligencia artificial. O sea, no se puede documentar bien el fenómeno, pero enseguida se quiere regular y eso es lo que a mí me preocupa. Sí, me entusiasma claramente, digamos, el espacio digital. El espacio digital abrió canales de comunicación. Creo que hay que defenderlo, que hay que cuidarlo, que permite, digamos, la expresión de muchos sectores que si no, no podrían estar, digamos, digamos, en el debate, digamos, que pone en discusión algunos temas. O sea, eso es lo que digamos, a mí me entusiasma para seguir trabajando en esto y tratar de mejorar y no tener respuestas regresivas. ¿Qué hicimos con respecto a la elección en Argentina? Empezamos a mirar los productos electorales de las plataformas, básicamente aquellos que proveían información sobre avisos, digamos, publicidad política, en todo el proceso, digamos, electoral, desde el inicio de la campaña hasta el final, que fue un proceso muy largo, desde agosto hasta noviembre, y ahí, digamos, tratamos de mirar, digamos, el rendimiento democrático de estos productos electorales. ¿Qué quiere decir esto? Digamos, si era eficaz o si se podía entrelazar de una manera eficiente con las formas que en Argentina, digamos, se diseñaron, o sea, las reglas o una regulación suave que fueron acuerdos éticos entre autoridades electorales y plataformas. Si los productos electorales, bueno, se monitoreaban bien desde las autoridades electorales y si la información provista podía servir incluso a la ciudadanía para mejorar el proceso electoral. Eso fue lo que nosotros hicimos, pero tal vez lo podemos profundizar después.
Thank you, Cecilia. You brought up AI. I think that had we, and we did, ask this question about what keeps people up at night back in January, February, absolutely everyone back then was saying artificial intelligence potential to like amplify disinformation and other online harms. And really, we didn't see that come to fruition at scale this year. I expect we may in other election cycles, 2028 probably. I would add, so at DDIA, we've worked this entire year around understanding the impact of online harms on Latino communities in the United States, and diasporas, but also Latinos who've been here for generations. We did both polling to get to how familiar and believing people were in different disinformation narratives and claims, but also to understand who are the folks that engage with this information most, what about them lends them to engage with this information. And so what keeps me up at night is we found that people are very, very familiar with disinformation. Things like, for example, I'm sure you've all heard this, but the false claims that non-citizens are voting in mass in the US elections. 50% of people that we polled, 3,000 Latinos back in March and April, and again in September, said that they had seen that. But the good news is, and I think that for me is what I'm excited about, we've actually found that the majority of people are not believing disinformation. They're either outright rejecting what they're seeing, or they're not sure if what they're seeing is true or false. That was 62% of Latinos that we polled back in March and April, and 66% in September. And so I don't know, right? It depends. If you look at it, the side of critical thinking and skepticism is good because people are evaluating information. Or you could take it the other side, which is to say people are becoming skeptical of absolutely everything they see on social media, and that's not great either. But for us, we did see a little bit of resilience, and trust in certain election stakeholders went up. So election administrators and secretaries of state, that went up by a few percentage points as well between March and April and September. And I really thought that with the volume of disinformation that we've seen in the US going up, that we would also see more people believing disinformation and more distrust. And that doesn't seem to be quite what we see when we talk to Latino voters, at least. So that's my silver lining for what it's worth. I wanted to go to you, Pedro. Some of our speakers brought up standards, regulations, solutions. I wondered if you could speak a bit about IACHR's recommendations to counter online harms and how those work to tackle some of the challenges that were raised keeping people up at night. Do you think that international standards can help us get to a better online world, or do solutions need to be very country specific, both one or the other?
I totally agree with the idea that the international standards of human rights and democracy are useful for understanding and for attending the challenges of social media. But more than creating new ones, that is challenging itself, the previous one we've had are really important. So as a general view, this anxiety of having a specific bill, a single law that is going to solve the whole problem of social media, I think it's not only naive, I think it has also become a way to avoid what is the real question, is that we have a fractured society everywhere. So, for example, just to give, short recommendations we've shared recently. Uh, we need better political parties. We need, better leadership. In the school of democracy, the bully should not be the president. If we make a parallel with elections and soccer game, no, we all know that how to make a goal. The goal is not to kick the ball in the face of an attendee or a fan. No, but so there are some basics, some groundings of democracy that should be attended. And that's why, for example, we consider, and I'm quoting a recent report from us, that it is necessary to build political party systems and foster electoral norms and customs that encourage political parties to promote legitimacy and trust in democratic institutions. Political parties must refrain from promoting disinformation campaigns because they often do that. Discrimination, hatred, and intolerance, whether by themselves or through third parties. I mean, there are some scenarios in which the political leader does not require or need to say something. The permission, the tolerance in his or her surrounding is good enough to have an impact in the fracture of the society and in the electoral process. That's why, for example, and this is a specific recommendation, we want to enact a domestic laws that require political parties to have their own mechanism that explicitly states that their members have a duty to not contribute to disinformation, violence, or discrimination, and allow for the resolution of disputes in the events of non-compliance with such provisions. So, which is the role of the political party that gives the floor to a leader that becomes someone that promotes actively or at least tolerates discrimination, because as far as I understand, discrimination is not allowed. No? So it's part of an ecosystem. Then, not to keep the conversation in me, there are some other recommendations, for example, with ads. One thing is the attention to social media content that is, let's say, grounded and shared and spread through the community that could include artificial intelligence or bots or whatever. But in the other side, there's a business behind. So if we have profit that gets power and benefit from hate, from disinformation, we have another level of attention. And I know in this event, there's really good people that are going to talk about, but in our report, we included that too, digital literacy. I mean, we need people aware of the changes in the ecosystem in these two poles that you shared between skepticism and full skepticism and that identity with my leader. No? So there's a middle in between, and we need prepare people. And I think there are good news here. Youth is aware. I mean, because probably the most prominent actors of this information do have a PhD. I mean, it's not related with basic education. And then finally, journalism. We need journalism we need to help journalism to take explicit distance from actors that behave or try to behave as journalists. And today is Halloween, dressed as journalists, but they are not journalists, they are propaganda actors. We need to help journalists to find that place. Uh, but also we need relevant actors, including politicians, private sector, uh, respecting the space of journalism. Because journalism, I think this is the best moment of journalism, but we are surrounded by a lot of noise, and probably there's not enough attention under.
Thank you for that. Both you and Marta brought up the need for better political parties or more responsible political leadership. I think that's really, it resonates with me because some of the polling that we did, what we found was that the biggest correlators between people engaging with disinformation, they were not, for example, a lack of education or low levels of education or lack of access to correct information. Like people who had that were not the ones that were both seeing and believing disinformation most often. The people that were both exposed to disinformation and engaging with it most often actually tended to express they had really high interest in politics. So their values and identities are really connected to the political party's vision. They tended to be conspiratorial already, and they tended to choose to consume very hyperpartisan news and information. And so I think when we talk about solutions, that's a huge, huge point of it. I wanted to go to Iria and Cecilia because in the solutions conversation for a long time now, we've talked about freedom of expression and the role of freedom of expression. And a lot of bad actors sometimes will try to derail the solutions conversation by equating everything to censorship or any action that you take online to censorship. But I do realize that the nuances of the discussion are worth exploring. And so I wanted to ask you, Iria, we can start with you because in places like Venezuela, governments have taken that too far and they are censoring speech and they are punishing dissent. And so what challenges come up for you both in discussions about freedom of expression and disinformation? And how can we as a community think about navigating that line when we're talking about legislation, regulation, and solutions?
Well, I'm not a big fan of regulating speech, and I think it came out of before the internet era. So I always was trusting freedom of speech and having a plural public sphere was good for societies and good for democracy in general, and it continues to be. I think over-regulating speech create not only it's not only censoring the public debate of ideas, but it's also affecting freedom of association, which I think is very important, and the ability of people to understand public affairs. So I would be cautious about the pressure to pass legislation, trying to curtail disinformation, even though because disinformation is a very hard thing to define and identify, but more important because I believe it is necessary to share ideas in a public affair, in a contexted public affair. So, and that I think that is part of democracy, and it's part of getting strong institutions to have that possibility. I think sometimes people confuse disinformation with propaganda with outright lies. Those are different animals. And politicians always will do propaganda as part of the political fighting. Disinformation is more manipulative, while outright lies should be just pointed out, and you don't need a law for that. I think what we need to have a better, cleaner public space, a public conversation in social media is precisely having more people engaged, more people participating. And that means more people educated about public affairs, more people being able to understand what are the issues being discussed and how those issues affect their interests, and being able to articulate that in a way that is affect other people's understanding of the issue. So more pluralism, more expression for different groups of the society will probably be better to fight information manipulation and to grow a more strong public sphere than censoring and having legislation curtailing freedom of expression.
Absolutely. Cecilia, I wanted to go to you with that same question. Also because you used to serve in the Chamber of Deputies in Argentina. And so I wondered if you could both talk a little bit about how you thought about navigating the line between freedom of expression and governance, but also, in your view, how can governments that are thinking about solutions, legislation, regulation, better communicate across borders to share some lessons learned about their country's specific experiences. And also, I mean, to that end, to track narratives that are flowing across borders, because we know that when it comes to online harms, those are not confined by any country border. So I'll go to you next. I think you might be on mute.
Bueno, lo que yo entiendo, digamos, con este problema, por un lado, es, digamos, cómo enfrentamos, yo no creo que haya que hacer una regulación excesiva, ¿no? sobre la problemática de la desinformación. De nuevo, creo que hay que construir evidencia sobre cómo afecta el proceso electoral, porque se ha hablado mucho, ¿no? de la desinformación. Hay acciones específicas como los fact-checkers, como, digamos, los trusted flaggers. O sea, ahí existe esto, ¿no? Y seguramente, digamos, digamos, dada la Digital Service Act, digamos, el modelo de trusted flaggers puede ser que sea tomado en otros países, ¿no? En la región ahora todavía no está, es algo voluntario por parte de las plataformas porque hay autorregulación. Pero a mí lo que me preocupa es qué pasa cuando no tenemos esta regulación, cuando hay autoridades electorales que no sean independientes. A nivel nacional, en Argentina, nosotros tenemos una autoridad independiente, pero a nivel subnacional esto es más complicado porque la democracia opera en distintos niveles. Hemos tenido episodios donde se obligó a bajar contenido o se detuvo a personas por supuestamente opinar en contra de, digamos, de una persona política. Entonces, la arbitrariedad, por un lado, ¿no? Eso sí me preocupa mucho más que la desinformación, digamos, y sus efectos. Me preocupa mucho más. Me preocupa mucho los pedidos abusivos para bajar contenido en contextos informales, es decir, cuando no hay una regulación, digamos, hay canales informales de comunicación entre autoridades electorales y plataformas, eso existe. Entonces, digamos, se controla, las plataformas controlan los procesos electorales, pero las autoridades electorales bajan, digamos, ordenan bajar contenido, pero no hay registro. Entonces, el primer principio que hay que instalar es que aquello que nos compete a todos o nos afecta a todos, como es el proceso electoral, porque le da legitimidad a los gobiernos, básicamente, lo tenemos que monitorear entre todos. Y entre todos significa que son todas las fuerzas políticas las que tienen que estar involucradas, o sea, mayor transparencia y visibilidad, y cada cual también hacer su cosa, ¿no? La sociedad civil marcando, informando, los investigadores generando evidencia, ¿no? Entonces, digamos, nos involucra a todos la democracia, involucra a todos la calidad de la democracia. Entonces, potenciar eso con este principio, ¿no? Que es aquello que nos compete a todos, nos ocupamos todos. Digamos, me parece que ese es el principal principio, y desde los gobiernos, perdón, la última pregunta que tú has sumado es, bueno, sí, no, me parece que no hay tanto interés, pero básicamente, digamos, no hay tanto interés en ocuparse. Lo que sí me parece es que hay que traer a las plataformas a las discusiones, ¿no? Desde los gobiernos, porque las dejan afuera. Entonces hay como una legitimidad de decir, bueno, las plataformas no las tocamos y lo que pasa es lo que dijo A o lo que dijo B, o lo que hace A o lo que hace B, pero dejamos de lado, digamos, bueno, a sentarse en lugares, digamos, como un congreso, digamos, como los congresos nacionales, a invitar a las plataformas a que cuenten cuáles son sus planes de acción, cómo han mejorado o dan herramientas para eso, y que vengan también investigadores, digamos, como nosotros que evaluamos los productos electorales, que podamos hacer devoluciones y que podamos participar en un proceso, digamos, más abierto de las acciones de las plataformas, porque a las plataformas no se las monitorea.
Exactly. Yeah. Cecilia, thank you so much. I'm going to go to Pedro for one last question about platform accountability. Marta, I'll come to you next about media literacy and education, because I think we definitely should spend some time on that. But Pedro, to you, we've discussed criminalizing content brings a lot more problems than it solves. Oftentimes, it's hard to define what violates standards, social standards, what is and is not disinformation. But in your view, what more do the platforms need to be doing? They've done a lot in the past. This year, a lot of them walked back trust and safety teams. But still, I feel like there's not enough that they're doing. And in our case, we've seen that at least in non-English languages and in countries in our region, oftentimes the focus is secondary. But what have they done well? And then what more needs to happen? What more do they need to do?
I mean, to recognize that things are going well in this scenario could be, I mean, probably I mean, like a big hope. What I think it's important from tech platforms is that they are not isolated from, for example, business and human rights standards, and part of the equation that the whole society has to put in place is the business model. I mean, the business model should include democratic values and human rights as the border of the benefit, because in the last years we've experienced that violations to human rights and attempts to democracy could increase the benefit of the digital ecosystem. So I think it requires a big commitment from the tech platforms to say, okay, I'm going to win as much as democracy and human rights allows me, because I'm not going to put money in my pocket with discrimination and attempts to democracy. I think that it's a political commitment that is not clear yet. Then in the field of regulation, there are some things that we have in the past that are very useful now that are not highlighted as I would expect. So for example, regulation of social media is not a shortcut to censor faster. So it's a temptation from the state, for the state, to over-regulate, to adapt the behavior online to in a shape that is more comfortable. No? So we have a three-part test. So what is, I mean, there's a lot of people that says that freedom of expression online is an unlimited right. That's wrong. In democracy, freedom of expression, it's a right that has limits. So what is being challenged is the capacity of state institutions, tech platforms, and the society as a whole to put in place limits to freedom of expression, but in the frame that we've built in democratic institutions. Then we also should avoid to transfer state responsibilities to private actors. That could be so risky. I mean, we all have had the experience of using a specific social media that 10 years ago was with one view. It changed the ownership, and now has a very different approach to freedom and democracy. So the risk of that these companies could be bugged or could be sold is itself a high risk of putting in their hands duties that should be in hands of democracy. So probably there are two approaches. the EU opted for a very, I mean, the DSA, no, in which, I mean, it's just being challenged now, and there's a lot of requirements that are even hard to fulfill, but those are, let's say, strong hands in the conversation. The approach that I think is complementary with inter-American standards is a due process one, no? That has a lot of ingredients of transparency. For example, we need more information about the way these companies work in order to have a better comprehension of the challenges to democracy and human rights. But finally, we are not going to be successful in that if we do not balance the capacity of different actors. So my experience being a special rapporteur for the last 4 years at the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights is that when I call, for example, the private and tech sector to a conversation, they are prepared. They sent, I mean, not a single one, but a bunch in a great team that it's understanding what is happening at UNESCO, at the UN, at the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, in different scenarios, the Global Digital Compact. So when I call member states, the response is not the same. I would say that from around 30 countries that I monitor, I recognize internal capacities at the level of the conversation in around 4. So we need member states better prepared for the conversation. And I'm not talking about civil society on journalism. I mean, the scenario you have here in the US where you have civil society that is engaged with the conversation is not the same one as Bolivia. It's not the same one as Paraguay. It's not the same one as several countries in the region. So we need to balance the scenario because the knowledge, the capacities, and the information that is around is not the same for different actors that, I mean, do have tensions and also that some interests are crushed.
I want to add a few comments about the role of platforms. I'm glad everyone here is kind of going away from this idea of overregulation, and I agree with Pedro's points on the dangers, the risk of having content moderation being a core responsibility of platforms. I think it's very risky possibility of privatizing is privatizing public speech. Even in the best case scenario, the best intentions of the people working on the platform is going to have some side effects. But there are a couple of things I want to add. The cases are important for kind of having a better environment in the platforms. One is transparency. I think that is crucial. Platforms should be making more efforts in conveying to the public what they are seeing in their platform. Particularly, one of the things that is very relevant is the kind of requests they receive from governments, particularly authoritarian governments or countries in where there are conflicts, ongoing conflicts. In those cases, really help for the society as a whole to have information what those governments are requesting in terms of private information about people posting in those platforms, which is an issue in several countries. Also, we need more transparency about the economics behind the platforms. Something is being very, very successful in understanding information manipulation is following the money. See, we had access to the advertisement budget in these platforms that helps to understand what kind of actors are pushing what kind of contents. And they probably had the right to push their content. I won't disagree with that, but it's important for the society to know who is behind that content. So who is trying to convey this particular position? Who is trying to convince, to persuade the society that this is the way to go? So having that information available will make for a healthier information environment, and it also will help to identify what are the actors who are infringing the law. Most of the times, the harmful content, the problematic content is already subject to some legislation. So people tend to talk a lot about children's sexual abuse material, or inciting violence, inciting terrorism. All those things are already banned for for some legislation. We don't need a special legislation for those things in social media. But we know who is pushing those contents, and platforms have the way to know, and they get that information to researchers working in this space. That will be help to identify who are the actors and proceed to control the spread of that kind of content. That is something we somewhat having in the past 5 years ago. We were moving in that direction, and in the last couple of years have been stopped. So most of the agreements for having access for journalists, for research, academic researchers or investigators of this information have been slowed down or even closed down to completely, giving some pressures against platforms here in the United States, who are the biggest one. Even the Article 41 in the Digital Service Act allow mandate transparency for platforms to provide the access to researchers, but we haven't seen that much in real implementation, and is concentrating in European researchers. And the only way for people outside Europa to have access to that possibility is partnering with the Europeans. So that is another restriction too. So we working on those issues, greater transparency about government requests and greater transparency about who is buying apps in platforms will help a lot.
Thank you. I'm realizing we're almost out of time. Marta, I want to go to you. To pivot the conversation toward media literacy and education, we know from research that this is one of the best solutions to build resiliency for human beings. Like, we are engaging with information from our couches every day. We need to be able to be evaluating what it is that we're sharing. I think that teachers across the Americas have already begun to engage around this. I met a woman, an elementary school teacher last week, who told me that she teaches her students out of a website called Octopuses Walk on Land. And apparently they go in and they kind of evaluate pieces of content, and her students are very young. They're between the ages of 6 and 8, which I thought was really interesting. But I wondered if you could talk a little bit about, when we talk about specialized classes, media literacy, digital literacy, what does that actually mean? And what gaps in education in Latin America and the Caribbean still exist for media literacy?
I think media literacy and education could be a part of a problem in a context that is not the one that we face in Latin America and the Caribbean. I think there's a lot of gaps. I mean, it's important, no? It's important for people to be able to question what they're consuming, including the media. But the gaps, and I know we're having this conversation in the context of the US election, but I think it maybe from the example of Mexico and other parts of Latin America, maybe some things resonate with you, even though our context, our privileges are very, very far away from each other. First, I think we have to question what's the ecosystem for the media to work. If journalists, the media are being constantly harassed by politicians, political parties, there's not freedom of expression. There's not freedom of information, because they will get either censored or they will decide to self-censor. So this is really important, like stigmatization, to be facing strategic lawsuits against public participation or judicial harassment, if defamation laws are still in place and if they are part of the criminal law instead of the civil law. And also, as a previous panelist mentioned, follow the money. Who's the one paying for the advertisement? Who's the one paying for the major media companies? What's the relationship between them? Are they being really in this public expenditure or the exercise of public resources, public money, just if they're giving their money only to one media, of course, this is not, it's not ethic. It means that it could very much mean that it's going to be propaganda instead of proper journalism. There's also the digital divide, that it's not only the people who have or don't have access to internet, but also who's connecting. For instance, in Mexico, a lot of women in the communities' rural areas are not holders of their own cell phones. They participate in this still very much machista and patriarchal community where they are not holders of their own things, not even a cell phone. And also, it doesn't matter if you have a cell phone, there's not enough power, there's not enough money to be able to pay for this. And there's also the thing with net neutrality, which means that there are a lot of packages of cell phone entities. That means that you are able to click and participate in digital platforms, but you don't have access to internet because it's just a very small catalog on what internet is. So it doesn't matter that you are willing and you are aware that maybe some message you received from your aunt could be misleading. It doesn't matter because you can't click on it to be able to find out more information. And at the same time, since elections and public participation has been more present in the digital arena, there's a lack of understanding, at least I'm going to speak on the Mexican government, to go in person to the communities that decide to don't participate in the technologies, because it's their way of life, it's their cosmovision, it's that way, and we have to respect that. So how can we nurture this public participation in elections, not just saying we have to solve everything on the internet, because we still have offline things we have to solve right away. So yeah, I think media literacy is important, education is important, but it's not what we're facing right now in the Americas. It's not this of AI, etc. We're not facing that. We're still facing the same person that is saying the same, spreading the same disinformation on the street that in their platforms. So I think this is very, very important to acknowledge. We're not facing a new problem. We're just facing it in a new arena. Well, new because it's really like 30 years old. But yeah, I think those are the most important topics I wanted to address.
Thank you so much for bringing up that perspective. I think that sometimes a lot of the partners that we work with, a lot of people that we work with have approached this from like what is the most persuasive digital message that we can come up with to counter disinformation, or we need to be testing pre-bunking and inoculation, which is something that we've done, messages, but we forget that no one is going to be persuaded by a 2-minute video. They are going to be persuaded if they have in-person, one-on-one communications with people. And so grassroots organizing, in the US context at least, is way more important for a lot of Latino communities in a lot of states here than digital grassroots organizing. And I think that's an incredibly good point that we can't forget, is that like there is still a huge, huge divide in countries like Brazil, where I'm from as well, where people aren't even getting access to the internet to begin with, or if they are, it's very limited. So thank you for bringing that up. I have one last question that we're going to wrap up, which is just that for all four of you, if you could sort of leave our audience with one thing that you believe policymakers or local government officials or civil society, and in this virtual room, I think we have about 50 people watching virtually, if there's one thing they can be doing to better collaborate or to support organizations like yours, what would that be? And I'll start with Pedro.
I double think maybe the second or the third.
Sure, I'll give you a minute. Iria?
being the first is hard, but and there are many things we can do. And for me, the first one is to stop thinking in binaries. Uh, uh, just the first binary I would want to get rid of is this idea of offline, online. So we lived in a continuum. Some people spend more time using social media. Some people spend more time browsing the internet. Some people spend more time listening to radio. Some people spend more time watching TV. Some people spend more time talking to somebody in the corner of the street they live. But all those things is interconnected. So one space where I saw that melting all the sources of information is WhatsApp. You came from a country with very heavy in the use of WhatsApp. It's my case too. So everything happens in WhatsApp, and there you see how people tell gossip. They hear for next door the neighbor. They share scenes they watch in television. They share scenes they read in books because people still read books, even though some people tend to forget about those. So since they listening to the radio, since they see in social media, all of those things are shared. And people are affected by continuous information, even though you are not in a particular social media platform, you will get that message via WhatsApp. So it's something we are seeing. So we are exposed to a lot of the same information, even though we get that information from different sources. And we all interact in a common space in which this abundance of information, and sometimes this information too, is part of the reality. It's not something foreign. It's not something alien. It's part of our everyday life. So understanding that, understanding also this is transnational, is cross borders. Everything is happening in Wisconsin is affected by something is happening, I don't know, in Panama. So that is part of our reality. And we need to be aware of that, be aware of the cross-contamination, the transnational flows of information, and the interaction between what happened in online platforms and what happened at grassroots level. That is something we saw very well in the Venezuelan electoral campaign, for instance, how the interaction between WhatsApp and grassroots, every street movement was a real powerful movement. And I think it's something we are watching here with the Latino community in the United States. And some people are kind of completely unaware of those dynamics, and we need to be aware of those dynamics, understanding that, and incorporating them to the strategies we had to deal with an information manipulation.
Absolutely. We have about 2 minutes left. So Cecilia, I'll go to you, Marta after, and then we'll end with Pedro. You got X time. Cecilia.
Bueno, muy breve entonces para darle lugar a todos. Para mí lo central es distinguir entre lo que es digamos, la dinámica que generan los responsables, los funcionarios, los políticos, muy diferente de lo que pasa con la ciudadanía. Hay que focalizarse en esos mensajes, ¿no? Porque circula mucha información, pero son ellos los responsables, o sea, ir hacia, digamos, a responsabilizar a partidos políticos y líderes políticos. Para mí es ahí donde hay que monitorear y generar evidencia. Anterior a eso hay que generar estados que tengan información accesible, porque si no, no se pueden chequear los mensajes o no se puede chequear la desinformación, y eso en América Latina, o por lo menos en nuestra región, está bastante mal, esa cuestión.
Thank you, Marta.
I think for me, the most important thing is to accept that just to look to the electoral process through the lens of the digital arena is to also be short-sighted. We have to think about an ecosystem, a media ecosystem, a free flow of information ecosystem, and what does it mean and what does it entail? Because sometimes, yes, the platforms are going to be the ones who have to tackle, but sometimes it's going to be national legislation, as a lot of my colleagues have mentioned, to say, okay, what kind of expenditure you're doing as a political party. There has to be a consequence if you're spreading disinformation, if you are violating the electoral integrity. There has to be a consequence, and that has to be put like in a proper legislation, and it has to be addressed for those actors, not for the society, because we're all very much entitled to have our own opinion, and if that opinion is wrong, I'm entitled to be wrong. And also, I think it's important to understand when we say something, it's not unprotected as freedom of speech. What does it entail? It's not, oh, it's just going to be taken down. Oh, it's not, you can't say that. It's like a whole spectrum of lack of protection to your own rights. So when you're asking something to not be protected, it means next time it could be you. Next time your speech could be taken as a hazard to democracy, and that's why it's going to be taken down, or it's going to be removed from the public spectrum. So I think it's important to be able to know what we're asking for when we say something shouldn't be allowed.
Thank you. Pedro, we'll close with you.
I have three very short. The first one is, please avoid simple solutions to complex situations, and it could be adjusted like faster solution or trendy solutions to complex situations. The second one, I think it's more like societal one. There's a day after the election, and we have to talk with our neighbor and to our relative that it's in the other side of the political dispute. And third, the more power you have, the more explicit your commitments with this should be, even your resigns. So please, tech sector, you should win less or get less money because the cost of that curb is too high for democracy and human rights.
Thank you. And for me, I would say just one thing, which is that I think sometimes when we think about social media and elections, we're thinking about electoral cycles, but we forget that the years in between elections are equally important, because that's when infrastructure gets built. The narratives, the claims, the online harms, they don't stop because an election stops. And I think sometimes partners, funders, the media, people kind of tune out when the election ends, and it's important that we kind of sustain engagement. I think year by year, next year, for example, I think will be really important for laying the groundwork for the next couple of years. So that's what I would say. So thank you so much to my panelists. Thank you all so much for joining us. The program is not over yet. So I'll hand it back to, I think, to you to introduce Felipe.
Yeah, we have a
Oh,
couple
we have some questions.
online.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
right. Thank you. So we'll let.
Yes, I'll read them. So the first one is, should social media platforms be held accountable for the content shared on their platforms during elections? If so, what kind of regulatory measures would be fair and effective?
So I think we touched on a little bit of that in the discussion itself, but that's a really big question that comes up a lot. Anyone want to start? Iria, I saw you nodding.
Particularly against making platforms responsible for content others share. And that platform, I believe, as I said before, platforms are responsible for transparency about coordinated campaigns, about paying campaigns, that making that information available to the public, but they are not responsible for a specific speech for a specific people. So there is, everyone is responsible for what they say, and authorities should be looking at those cars. That was that recent action, U.S. Treasury against companies who were spreading disinformation, a small company who were spreading disinformation, and they went after that specific companies instead of going after the platform. I think that is more effective to curtail disinformation without restraining freedom of speech.
Cecilia, Marta, do you both agree?
Parcialmente, Marta, perdón, parcialmente porque de hecho lo que nosotros vemos es que las plataformas sí hacen moderación de contenidos porque tienen reglas, ¿no? Internas, digamos que son digamos, el contrato con las personas que están ahí, bajan contenido e incluso usan la inteligencia artificial y usan algoritmos para monitorear el contenido. O sea, lo hacen de hecho, por lo que creo que tal vez, como decía Iria, bueno, sí, transparentar cómo lo hacen, pero ellas a sí mismas se responsabilizan por lo que sucede ahí porque monitorean constantemente qué es lo que está pasando ahí. O sea, creo que ese punto no hay que olvidarlo, sí necesitamos verlo más, ¿no? O tratar de buscar información, ver mecanismos de cómo mirar qué está pasando ahí, más que nada en momentos sensibles como las elecciones, pero bueno, y algo que también rescato es esto de los momentos preelectorales, ¿no? Por fuera de las elecciones, que también, digamos, ahí se prepara, digamos, mucho, se anticipa mucho la campaña, se anticipan estas narrativas, como decían recién. Por lo que, digamos, habría que ver en qué marco, ¿no? Tomar una decisión con respecto a eso, pero de hecho lo hacen, entonces habría que ver cómo lo hacen, aquello que no las obligamos, pero lo hacen.
Marta, I saw you came off mute before, so what do you think?
Yes. I think it's interesting to be having this conversation with people, and maybe the person that is asking is from the US, because we often in the Americas, in other parts of the world, because most platforms, of course, are in the US and they're created in the US, and the people that operate them, that programmed all the automatics, are people who are native English speakers or very fluent in English, and also everything is done in English, and it's everything comes from the US perspective, no? So first that, because in our context, as Cecilia was mentioning, in other places where we don't speak English, and we don't speak even like, there's no one way of speaking Spanish. Cecilia speaks one way, I speak differently because we're from different parts of Latin America. Everything has been, a lot of content is being taken down by digital platforms, just because we don't even understand why. There's not like we don't even know why content is being taken down. Because it's automated, because the people that were programming don't speak our language, they don't understand the context, etc. And also because it's automated. No, there's no one like analyzing thing by thing what is going to be taken down. It's just poof, it goes down and we don't even know why. So I think that's one point. And the other one, I want to kind of give the question back. What do you think is going to happen if you make platforms responsible of third-party publications? Me, if I were the platform, I would be very much afraid to receive fines and to lose all my money and my resources, because I don't exist out of goodwill. No, I want to make profits. I have like a shark mentality, and I want to be able to make more money. So if you say that I'm going to be responsible for what Cecilia is publishing, I'm gonna censor Cecilia. I don't care what I don't care what she's saying. I'm gonna be filtrating everything she says. If there's a word that I suspect is gonna be bad for me, for my own interest, then Cecilia is gonna go off my platform. Like, I think those are the questions we have to make ourselves. Kind of to know what does it entail to say that a platform should be responsible for something is allowing the platform to have all the control, more that it already has, in our lives. So yeah, that's what. Thank you.
A question up here.
Since the COVID-19 pandemic, access to quality information is becoming increasingly paywalled. So that's something you didn't maybe directly touch on. And I know this is across, not just US based, it's also, you're trying to access like, newspapers or articles from different countries, it's paywalled as well. And the New York Times recently paywalled access to their podcast, The Daily, which covers a lot of domestic issues in the United States, as well as some within the region and throughout the world too. But also all of their election content is behind this paywall now. So do you think this factor or kind of component is fueling the spread of disinformation, because everyday citizens don't have access to like the New York Times, Washington Post, and other reputable mainstream media sources?
That's a great question and a complex one, I think. Pedro?
Sorry to.
During,
Heard you breathe next to me.
during a week in which we try to rely on what journalism and professional journalism and media outlets say, but also with the things that they did not say. So it's very complex. But I mean, I think that COVID-19 showed, I mean, something that was very reactive that could become um, a message from journalism. So we are used to talk about content moderation and hate speech. So platform, you should take action on this specific I mean, speech or message. But content moderation also involves relevance. So you remember that there was a specific period of time in which tech platforms put in a superior level of relevance the information that was related to COVID-19. Uh, why self-regulated and high-quality journalism is not asking for that kind of treatment through social media? I mean, the media outlets and journalism had chosen the path of this fight, and I think it's a very complex one, but there are good arguments in both sides about the digital economy, and paywall is part of that. But as journalism is getting into this labyrinth of we are really important, but no one is funding us, and and the work we do is so expensive. Our enemy propaganda is fast, cheap. Our newsroom requires more, and some architecture that is not the same as it used to be, because sometimes it's very melancholic the way we think about journalism. Content moderation is itself a way to put relevance. And I think that high quality journalism, self-regulated journalism, reliable journalism should ask for a better position in the social media ecosystem, as it happened with COVID-19. I mean, we're not talking about new strategies. We're just learning from a previous experience. And if that happens, probably paywall would not be required or necessary. I totally agree with the idea that as we pay streaming, like, I mean, everyone has the credit card ready for entertainment. For information, I have some doubts. And if I pay, let's say one, not two, or I mean, four subscription it's too much. No. So at the end of the day, if we are saying that journalism is important, there are some measures and strategies driven by media owners that are putting a high and long distance between the audience and journalism, while disinformation is very oiled. I mean, it's everywhere in WhatsApp chats and groups. So I think that would be important. And just to add something to the previous question, I think that ads, I mean, when you put money in social media, I think that the responsibility about the content that is paid is is not from the single person that is putting his credit card and sending a message. I think the responsibility there is shared. Then I think that part of the good practices that could become good regulation is that once a tech platform do have presence and interaction with, let's say, electoral authorities, you have to keep it. And you need very strong reasons if you want to, I mean, a single disagreement probably is not enough to avoid that interaction. It's good that democratic institutions do interact with tech platforms. But then what to do with dictatorships? I mean, we have also, let's say, electoral process in the region that are, I mean, are not democratic, at least in the results, which is the approach of tech platforms to the public debate in those countries, the propaganda or high quality journalism.
I want to add something about that. Maybe media organizations, journalists, and the society as a whole, particularly universities too, should be looking at way to develop a business model for information gathering and delivery who are public service. So it doesn't need for the consumer to pay for it, but they are provided to the society as a public service. We need to look more on that, because otherwise we are getting to be in a no win solution for everybody.
I know we're over time, but Marta, you mentioned you work with journalists often, and so I wondered if you had any thoughts about this question.
Yeah, I think it also goes back to the ecosystem part. I think there's no one way, there's no one answer to this question. I think there's a lot of nuances and a lot of factors that pitch in. I do think that a diverse media, a well-nourished media, a non-censored media, a plural media, a diverse media is gonna help balance all the information that is being offered in a society. I think, yeah, my answer, I'm sorry, is just like a very low popular answer, but I think an ecosystem is going to be the thing that we need to move towards to, instead of just thinking about one way answer.
Absolutely. I think the biggest challenge of the entire discussion we had today is that there are no clear-cut silver bullets. There's no one way to answer these questions. They're just tough challenges. So thank you all so much for the time, for all the work that you're each doing in your own countries to solve for these problems. And thank you to the Dialogue team. And I'll pass it now to Felipe Estefan, who will give some closing comments. Thank you.
Thank you all. Give it a hand. Give a hand to our panelists and our moderator. That was a fantastic discussion. Thank you to everyone who is also watching online. My name is Felipe Estefan. I'm the Vice President for Latin America at Luminate, a global philanthropic organization that is working to ensure that technology benefits the public interest. I want to thank Tamara, Daniel, Bernarda for hosting this event at the Inter-American Dialogue. I'd also be remiss if I didn't recognize the presence of Michael Shifter here. I first met Michael about 15 years ago when I came to DC to be a producer at CNN. And all of us who've continued to work to build bridges between Latin America and the US are certainly doing that work, building on your legacy. So thank you, Michael, for being here and for everything that the Inter-American Dialogue continues to do to hold space for these important conversations. And thank you to Roberta, Pedro, Iria, Marta, and Cecilia for their partnership and for their insights today. And I think I'd be remiss also if I didn't mention that we're having this conversation in a critical time here in Washington and for democracy in the United States and in Latin America. And as democracy is threatened around the world, it is pretty clear that technology should not be hindering democracy. I think we can all agree on that. As Iria was saying, we no longer live in worlds in which online and offline are divided, even in many of our countries in which the digital divide is still very significant. We are moving towards living in a fully digital world. And we need to ensure that in that digital world, technology is actually enabling a reimagination and a modernization of a democracy that actually works for all. And to have a conversation about how technology will do that, we have to have a conversation about those who hold power in society, both political power, and I very much appreciate the point about the need for stronger responsibility on the part of political leaders, but also those who hold tech power, because increasingly that is a smaller group of people, and most of them are white and American and men. And they are making decisions over what we understand to be acceptable speech. They're making decisions about what we understand to be true. And in a democracy that is truly pluralistic, the debates about how technology and society intersect are debates that need to include many more voices. Certainly that debates about regulation, and I quite appreciate the point about being mindful of the overreach of regulation and legislation. Those of us who are Latin American know a thing or two about when the state overreaches on regulation. I appreciate those conversations, but we also need to have a conversation about how we take action, because the current status quo is, quite frankly, unacceptable. We find ourselves in a situation in which those who hold power in society, especially those who hold tech power, are using technology to spread disinformation, to increase polarization, and to mass produce and distribute hate speech that exacerbates inequalities that are already exist in society. And technology doesn't have to be that way. Illuminate, we've been studying the narratives that move through popular culture that uphold current dynamics of tech power. And there's three that I want to share with you that I think are particularly compelling. One is that we are told that tech harms will only happen in the future. And if you look at popular culture, you'll find that narrative easily there. So Terminator in the year 3000, maybe tech will take over, but it's not now. It's now. The harm techs, we're living through them now. There's another narrative that upholds current tech power, and it's that the technology is too complicated for us to understand it. Only the people who build it in Silicon Valley really, really understand it and can have a debate that enables for it to be regulated. That is not true. I appreciated the point that Cecilia was making, which I would translate in English to the things that have to do with us matter to all of us. And technology has to do with all of us. And so it does matter to us. I think a third narrative that is currently upholding tech power is that it is users who are at fault. And so we see a lot in popular culture about the influencer that is too vain to get off their phone, as opposed to a discussion about how these technologies have been designed purposefully for them to be addictive and for them to hold our attention, and that there's people behind the decisions and the algorithms that are ensuring that that attention is capitalized in particular ways that benefit business models. And so I'll share with you as I come to a close a quick anecdote. I was once in Brazil in a conversation with a tech executive from a company that shall remain unnamed. And I said, why don't you have more transparency? And I think the point of transparency has come through and through clearly in this conversation. And he stood up and he pointed at me and he said, you are asking Coca-Cola to give you the recipe for Coca-Cola. And I said, no, I'm not asking Coca-Cola to give me the recipe for Coca-Cola. I'm asking you to give me the nutritional facts. Because the reality of the fact is that we are users of these platforms and we actually don't have a full sense of the way in which these technologies are affecting us. We have an anecdotal sense when we go into the family WhatsApp chain and we're trying to like prevent, people always blame the aunt, and I think that's unfair actually. And so I'm gonna blame maybe the uncle or the dad that all of a sudden sends that YouTube video that is totally not true. And we now know, for example, that in YouTube, young men within an hour go from gaming videos to videos that actually radicalize their positions. Data from the Center for Countering Digital Hate shows that. So I do think it is an urgent conversation that we need to have about how, even if they don't want to give us the recipe for Coca-Cola, we certainly at least can get the nutritional facts. And it is a conversation about transparency, but it is also a conversation about how those who hold power in society will wield that power, taking into consideration the diverse perspectives that ought to be informing those debates and being held accountable when they don't wield that power in the pursuit of public interest. So I hope that you know that this conversation does have to do with you, that you remain engaged in this conversation. And I thank you for your attention in today's event. Muchas gracias.